You hear that? That's what passes for justice in Rattle Creek Hollow now. The square was silent, except for a fresh-turned mound of soil and 3 men gripping shovels, still grinning at their own joke. You hear that? Vance Cordell said, pressing the heel of his boot into the packed earth. Something moved beneath the surface. Something that hadn't stopped breathing yet. That right there is what authority looks like in Rattle Creek Hollow. He swept his gaze across his crew and smiled the way a man smiles when he's decided he owns everything his eyes can reach. Go down another foot. Let him sit with it a while. A rider at the far edge of the square had watched all of it without a single twitch. That's enough, the stranger said. No one had heard him ride in. No one could say where he'd come from. And in the 30 seconds that followed those 2 words, the people of Rattle Creek Hollow would learn that the man who had spoken them wasn't making a suggestion. What unfolded next would be pressed into the minds of every surviving witness like a brand into hide. But to understand it, you have to understand what Cordell had done to this town. And you have to understand why a quiet man on a worn-out horse had ridden into a place he had no reason to be and spoken 2 words that cracked the world open. To understand Rattle Creek Hollow, you have to understand what it was before Vance Cordell ever set foot in it. In the spring of 1882, it had been a functioning town. Not wealthy, not booming, but functional in the rare way that frontier settlements sometimes managed to be. A marshal's office that still meant something. A schoolhouse with actual children sitting inside it. Sunday services that drew most of the population. And a water-sharing compact that kept the small ranchers and homesteaders from going to war over the Iron Rock Creek tributaries that kept the valley alive. The town's marshal was a man named Harlan Pruitt, who had worn the badge for 11 years without once making it something to be ashamed of. A short, stubborn, quietly resolute man of 54, gray-bearded, half-blind without his spectacles, and possessed of the deep, durable courage that belongs to men who have simply never allowed themselves to consider quitting. Cordell arrived in July of that year. He came on behalf of the Territorial Grazing Alliance, a land consortium backed by cattle money out of Fort Worth and railroad speculation money out of Kansas City. And he came the way men like him always came first, and with paperwork. The documents concerned the Iron Rock Creek water rights. The Alliance's legal team had located an irregularity in the original territorial land grant, an ambiguity in the old survey boundaries that, read a particular way, placed the valley's primary irrigation source under the authority of a parcel the Alliance had recently and quietly acquired from a bankrupt homesteader. Read that particular way, every small rancher in the Rattle Creek Valley was drawing water they no longer had any legal standing to draw. Marshal Pruitt had read the paperwork. He had sent for a territorial judge. The judge took 3 months to arrive and, upon arrival, reviewed the documents and declared the Alliance's interpretation plausible pending further survey. He then wrote back to the capital, leaving the valley in a legal fog that favored whoever was willing to apply the most force. Cordell was very willing. He was 38 years old, broad through the chest and narrow through the eyes, wearing a close-cropped dark beard and a coat that cost more than most men in that valley made in a month. His hands were large enough to suggest he had once done physical labor somewhere in his past, before he had worked out that other men's labor was more profitable than his own. He carried a .44 caliber revolver in a cross-draw holster on his left hip and moved through every room with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once walked into a situation he doubted he could control. He had brought 3 men with him, not showmen, workers, experienced, cold, practically violent. A former buffalo hunter named Stroud, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand and still grouped his shots with the right. A border enforcer named Bale, who had spent 4 years removing people from land that Texas cattle interests had decided they wanted, and who had developed a precise, clinical expertise in applying just enough violence to achieve compliance without drawing federal scrutiny. And a young man called Rennie, who didn't have much of a past yet, but had the flat, hungry eyes of someone actively going about the business of building one. Within 2 weeks of their arrival, 3 homesteaders had signed away their water access agreements, not willingly, because Stroud and Bale had visited each of them after dark and laid out the alternative with the measured, unhurried professionalism of men who had explained alternatives before and understood exactly how much detail was required. Marshal Pruitt had ridden out to the 3rd homesteader's property the morning after one of those visits and found the man sitting on his porch in the gray pre-dawn with a lantern and a rifle and the expression of someone who has accepted a choice he never got to make. The homesteader told him what had happened. Pruitt rode back to town. He wrote a detailed report. He sent it to the territorial marshal's office in the capital. He received, 6 weeks later, a letter saying the matter was under review. He wrote 3 more reports. Each one disappeared into silence. On a Tuesday morning in September, Pruitt rode out to Cordell's field headquarters, a large tent camp on the Alliance's newly claimed parcel, and formally and in writing informed Cordell that he was opening a criminal investigation into the coercion of the valley's residents, and that Cordell's men were to cease all contact with Rattle Creek citizens until the investigation concluded. Cordell read the document. He folded it with care. He looked at Pruitt with the expression of a man who has just been presented with a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine threat. He said in a tone of patient, genuine courtesy that the marshal was free to pursue whatever inquiry he saw fit, and that the Alliance welcomed full cooperation. That night, Stroud and Bale came to the marshal's office. They had not come to cooperate. What they did to Harlan Pruitt over the following hour was deliberate and thorough, and designed to send a message not only to Pruitt, but to every person in Rattle Creek Hollow who might be wondering whether the badge on his chest still meant anything at all. They broke his right hand. They broke 2 ribs. They took his badge and his service revolver and left him on the office floor with a note, written in Cordell's precise hand, expressing that the Alliance regretted any misunderstanding and hoped the marshal would take the opportunity to reflect on the appropriate limits of his jurisdiction. Pruitt dragged himself to Doc Fenner's surgery. Doc Fenner set the hand, bound the ribs, and told him in a low, careful voice that he had a wife and 3 daughters and could not in good conscience testify to anything he had or hadn't seen that night. Pruitt understood. He went home. He spent 3 days in bed, and on the 4th day he got up, pinned a spare badge to his shirt with his left hand because the right was splinted to uselessness, and walked back to his office. Cordell had watched from across the street with something close to respect. That respect lasted 4 days, until Pruitt rode out to the valley's largest remaining independent rancher, a widow named May Ashford who ran 300 head on land her husband had broken before he died, and told her plainly what was coming and advised her to get her title documents in order and contact a lawyer in the capital before the Alliance's paperwork reached the territorial court. May Ashford thanked him. She went inside. She wrote 4 letters. Cordell learned about the letters within 48 hours. He came to the marshal's office himself that time. What happened inside was not witnessed by anyone because Stroud had been posted at the front door and Bale had covered the alley window. What was witnessed at approximately 9 in the morning on the first Monday of October was Vance Cordell and his 3 men crossing the Rattle Creek Hollow Town Square carrying shovels, with Marshal Harlan Pruitt bound hand and foot, heading toward the center of the square where the old cistern had been filled in the previous spring. They dug for 40 minutes while the town watched through curtained windows and locked doors. Then they lowered Harlan Pruitt into the earth up to his neck. Then they kept going. Cordell addressed the town from the center of the square in the same measured, patient voice he used for everything. He explained that the previous arrangement, in which Rattle Creek Hollow had operated under the belief that it possessed independent legal authority, was being revised. He explained that the Territorial Grazing Alliance was prepared to be a constructive and generous partner to the valley's remaining residents, provided those residents developed a clear understanding of the nature of that partnership. He explained that Marshal Pruitt had been an impediment to that understanding and was being removed from his position, and that any resident with strong feelings about this was welcome to submit those feelings in writing to the Alliance's regional office in Fort Worth. He said all of this while Pruitt's face was still above the surface, dirt to his chin, eyes open and steady in a way that was costing him everything he had left. Then Cordell nodded to Stroud. Then there was only soil. The town of Rattle Creek Hollow had not moved, had not spoken, had stood behind its glass and its wood and its locked doors and watched the law of the territory get buried alive in its own town square while 3 men with shovels laughed and a 4th, in a fine coat, consulted his pocket watch. This was the reality of Rattle Creek Hollow on the morning the stranger rode in. Nobody saw him arrive. That was the first detail people reached for when they tried to reconstruct the sequence of events for the territorial inquiry later. One moment the square was empty except for Cordell and his crew and the raw earth and the sound of men amused with themselves. The next moment there was a rider at the eastern edge of the square, seated on a dark bay gelding with the absolute stillness of something that had simply always been there. like a post, like a shadow, like a feature of the landscape that no one had noticed until now. He was unremarkable. That was the second thing people noted. Canvas duster, road gray with trail dust, a battered hat with a cracked brim pulled low. Plain dark holster lashed to his right thigh with frayed rawhide. No silver, no decoration, nothing that made any announcement about anything. A man who looked at first glance like 100 other men who passed through small towns and left no mark. At first glance, Nora Adderley, who operated the dry goods store and was watching through the gap in her window shutters, would tell the territorial inquiry she had noticed his horse before anything else. It was standing with an absolute total stillness that horses simply did not achieve. Not shifting weight, not tossing its head, not reacting to the sounds of the square. She had seen horses trained for cavalry work, horses worked for cutting cattle, horses gentled by patient men over years of careful handling. She had never seen a horse stand the way that horse stood, as though it was waiting for a single specific signal and had made an arrangement with itself not to move until that signal arrived. Old Walt Digby, who had hauled freight across the territory for 3 decades and was sitting on the bench outside the livery because he had no particular place to be, noticed the stranger's hands resting on the saddle horn. Large hands, heavily calloused, and across the backs of both of them the faded, specific scarring that black powder leaves on skin over years of sustained and frequent use. Not one gunfight, not 10. The kind of accumulated marking that comes from a life measured in rounds fired. Digby had put his back against the livery wall and quietly lowered himself to sit on the ground. Cordell noticed the stranger at approximately the same moment his boot came down on the fresh earth and something shifted beneath it. He looked across the square at the rider. His expression did not change. He had the particular confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that patient, applied force had failed to resolve. He assessed the stranger with the brisk professional attention of someone cataloging a new variable rather than registering a threat. "That's enough," the stranger said. 2 words, quiet as a door easing shut, carrying across the square not because they were raised, but because the quality of the silence surrounding them made them land like stones dropped into still water. Cordell's hand rested on the wooden grip of his revolver. Not drawing, resting. The comfortable proximity of a man who has never once been wrong about his ability to produce the weapon when the moment required it. "This is alliance business, friend," he said. "Move along." The stranger did not move along. He dismounted. He stepped away from the horse with the same unhurried deliberateness that seemed to govern every movement he made. He walked to the edge of the square and stopped. Stroud, 20 feet to Cordell's right, shifted his weight. Bale, near the far edge of the mound, set his shovel down. Rennie, youngest and most eager, let his hand drift toward the revolver on his hip. Cordell studied the stranger for 3 long seconds. He was skilled at reading men. It was one of the things that had made him effective. He read posture and eye movement, and the small, involuntary signals of fear that men who were frightened tried to suppress and never fully managed to. He looked for the tells, the held breath, the stiffness in the shoulders, the overly careful stillness of someone working to appear calmer than they were. He found none of them. The stranger was looking at the mound of fresh earth in the center of the square. Not at Cordell, not at Stroud or Bale or Rennie, at the earth, with the focused, measuring attention of a man working through a specific calculation. "1 man in the ground," the stranger said, still not looking at Cordell. 3 shovels. Which one of you is going to use his? The question was delivered in the same flat, factual tone a man might use to ask about the price of grain. It was not a taunt. It was not a display. It was a man identifying the available options and waiting for the relevant party to select one. The silence that followed had physical weight. Rennie broke first. He was young and he was hungry for it, and he had been building a reputation, and this was exactly the kind of moment reputations got built in. His hand came up with his revolver in a motion that was fast for his age and his experience, which meant it was fast enough to impress anyone who had never seen fast. The stranger's draw was not a draw. It was a correction. The worn revolver cleared the frayed rawhide in a single motion, so stripped of everything unnecessary that it appeared to cost nothing at all. The shot came before Rennie's hammer had fallen, before his barrel had finished leveling, before the thought his hand had started had fully formed in his mind. The bullet struck the revolver out of Rennie's grip at the frame, not by design exactly, but by the cold arithmetic of a man firing at a target he could see clearly from 30 feet without any particular urgency. Rennie's gun hit the dirt. Rennie stared at his hand. His hand was whole. He did not process this for 3 full seconds. Stroud moved. Stroud was not young and not hungry. Stroud was experienced and cold, and had been in situations close enough to this one to understand that the instant the first shot was fired, the geometry of everything changed. He moved left, away from the line, bringing his rifle up the way a man brings a rifle up when he has done it 10,000 times, and the motion lives below the level of conscious thought. He was fast. The stranger was already moving, not away but toward the angle, closing distance on Stroud's side in 3 deliberate steps that reset the geometry entirely. When Stroud's rifle tracked to find him, the barrel was near enough that the stranger's left hand found the forestock and pushed it precisely 6 inches offline. The shot Stroud fired went into the dirt between them. Then the stranger's right hand pressed his revolver barrel against the underside of Stroud's jaw with the calm, exact placement of a man positioning a tool exactly where it belongs. Stroud became very still. "On the ground," the stranger said. The 3rd time he had spoken, the 3rd time it had been 4 words. Stroud went to his knees, then to his face, then his palms were flat in the dirt and he did not move. Bail was the last variable. Bail was the most dangerous variable, which the stranger had already understood from the way Bail had been positioned since the beginning. Slightly behind the mound, slightly to the angle, occupying the specific ground that a man who understands geometry takes when he is waiting for the chaos to reach its peak before applying his own solution. Bail had his revolver drawn and leveled, and from where he stood, he had a clean line and the particular cold composure of a man who is not surprised by anything that had happened in the last 90 seconds and is prepared to end the equation on his own terms. They regarded each other across the fresh-turned earth. "You're capable," Bail said, and meant it without offering it as a compliment. "Step away from the mound," the stranger said. Bail did not step away. He was calculating. His shot was clear. The stranger's revolver was aimed at Stroud's back, which meant addressing Bail required changing angle, which required time, which was Bail's opening. It was a genuine opening. Bail had worked with worse. "He's already dead," Bail said, meaning the man under the soil. "You shoot me, my finger finishes this. You lose them both." "No," the stranger said. The word was not a challenge. It was not defiant. It was the quiet, absolute correction of a man who has run the same numbers and arrived at a different answer and is sufficiently certain of his answer that the other man's version of it is simply wrong. Bail pulled the trigger. At that distance, in that silence, the sound of the cylinder rotating was audible across the square. The hammer came back. The firing pin traveled forward. The revolver misfired. A flawed primer, a damp cartridge. The specific, indifferent cruelty of machinery in a dry country where men oiled their weapons with care and the desert still found its way in. It happened. It happened rarely and at random and without any regard for who it happened to or when it chose to happen. Bail pulled the trigger again. The hammer dropped on the next chamber. The stranger had covered the distance between them in the time it took Bail to attempt the second shot. The revolver barrel connected with the inside of Bail's wrist with the precise, localized force of a man who knew exactly what he was breaking and broke nothing more than that. The revolver fell. Bail's right hand stopped working. The stranger put Bail on the ground with the flat efficiency of a man completing a task on a list. Then he turned to face Vance Cordell.